Great. We're done.
Right.
That was crazy. It's funny because technically there would still be 15 minutes to 2 hours, but we're at the time-ish, but it's like the information is just, it's so dense. I feel like
so dense, man. Yeah. It's like, I feel like unless the listener already has some background in this episode is just going to be like, what? Like when I start talking about A and B and reversible and irreversible, it's just like,
I anticipated that. And even in my mind, I had already planned how I would introduce the episode, something along the lines of like, if you're looking for a simple explanation, it's probably, you're probably best, I'll like add links, probably best to just read these articles, go to his website and read it. Cause this is going to be a big download.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast exploring topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research. I am your host, as always, James W. Gesso. Today's interview is going to explore and compare the pharmacological actions of antidepressant psychotropic medications with the actions of the classical psychedelics, as well as ayahuasca, MDMA, and ketamine. And the antidepressants we're going to explore include SSRIs, SNRIs, MAOIs, as well as NDRIs like Wellbutrin and Strattera. So who is this guest we're having on the show today? Well, it is Benjamin Malcolm, also known as the Spirit Pharmacist. Benjamin Malcolm completed a doctorate in pharmacy and a master's in public health prior to postgraduate training and board certification in psychiatric pharmacy. He currently holds a position in academia teaching psychiatric pharmacy, as well as offers consultant services for persons seeking information about psychedelics, as well as offers online courses on psychedelics at spiritpharmacist.com. There's an important correction about the courses Benjamin offers at spiritpharmacist.com that I will talk about in the outro. So hang around to the outro if by the end of the episode you're like, damn, I'm excited about this. Hang around to the outro to get that important update. Either way, we're about to get into the interview, but before we do, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube. Without your help, this podcast would not exist, so thank you very much. If you're not yet a patron of the show and you'd like to become a financial supporter of this podcast that you are, hopefully enjoying, you can head to patreon.com/James W. Gesso and pledge as little as a cup of coffee once a month. Anything is something, and it all goes a long way. And together it creates a sustainable income foundation for me to continue to invest time and money into the show. So thank you very much for helping support the show. Patreon.com/James W. Gesso, or links are in the description to this episode. You could also send me a one-time donation, also linked in the episode. So without much further ado, here is my interview with Benjamin Malcolm on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 140, exploring antidepressants and psychedelics.
Okay. All right. So Benjamin Malcolm, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
So you're known on the internet under the alias, the Spirit Pharmacist. I don't know if you like the term alias in this context, but it's what you're producing as a clinical pharmacist, if I'm correct.
Yep.
It's some pretty amazing content, and very expansive content, in particular around the use of, we'll say, just like classical clinical pharmacological medicine with psychedelics, which is only just kind of coming in over the last 10 years to get an understanding of what it's really doing to the body because of prohibition, and then how it's interacting with the drugs that are already established. And your content is just, it's incredible. And it's very, I think it's a very important sort of a website right now for the psychedelic movement, be it above ground or underground. So just kind of starting off with a big thank you for the work that you've been doing.
Thank you. I'm just so grateful that I have this outlet and that people find it of value.
Well, let's excuse me. Let's start in with a question around, because I want to explore antidepressants and their interactions with psychedelics, and then if time is allowed, I want to talk a little bit about amphetamines or not amphetamines, stimulants as well. And I kind of want to start with a sense of the differences between antidepressants and psychedelics, although from like a general standpoint, wherein kind of the theory behind their action. So in my book, sure, Decomposing the Shadow, back in 2013 about psilocybin mushrooms, I had proposed that they had worked opposite to each other in some way, that antidepressants help to block negativity so that you can exist inside of this realm of not being messed with by whatever unresolved, difficult stuff is inside of you that was previously giving rise to the symptoms of mental illness, particularly depression, and that psilocybin just goes in there and helps you work that stuff out so that it's no longer affecting your life. And it seems like to some degree that is what is being discovered more so in the science. Can you comment a little bit on that and maybe correct where I've got that off base?
No, I think you're pretty much right in that some of the science do suggest that they work in different types of ways or mechanisms, and certainly they have different pharmacologic mechanisms. Probably where they converge is they both, antidepressants are just general drugs that boost mood, and there are some that do not work on serotonin, but the vast majority, the most commonly used ones, all do work on serotonin. And most of the psychedelics that we talk about, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, DMT, also work on serotonin. So the discussion around antidepressants and psychedelics just in general is an important one because both of these drugs work on serotonin. And at the moment, these antidepressants, the serotonin reuptake inhibiting types of antidepressants, are essentially the ones that are indicated as first line, meaning the first thing that a doctor or clinician or psychiatrist is going to reach for the most common types of mental health problems, including things like depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD, and to an extent substance use disorders as well. The antidepressants usually don't treat substance use disorders, but the thought is that, well, there's usually some other condition that's leading to substance use, or substance use as a coping mechanism for a depression, anxiety, some history of trauma. So it could still be indirectly helpful. And, you're probably aware that, well, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance use disorders are essentially all of the things that are being targeted by psychedelics in the research as far as being able to help. So it seems that the stage is being set for this kind of, I don't want to say showdown, but essentially psychedelics are poised to start eating in to the bottom line of some of these types of antidepressants. So from this sort of angle, they're almost like poised as competitors. And we'll talk a lot more about the drug interactions, but they're not very compatible with each other generally either, which also kind of increases this narrative around ultimately being competitors in the marketplace rather than like things that coexist.
And additionally, the very paradigm of treatment is fundamentally different because you get on an SSRI compared to taking a psilocybin dose.
Yeah, so the sort of paradigm of treatment, right? And so I think this is actually what you were asking or alluding to at the beginning of the question is kind of like, well, don't they do sort of different things? And for pretty much all of the psychotropic substances, and by psychotropic, I simply mean a prescription drug that is proved right now to treat a mental health condition. That's what I mean by a psychotropic type of a drug or substance. But it's pretty well known that the existing psychotropics don't cure mental illness, and essentially the counseling or instruction is like, well, this medication, is potentially going to decrease your symptoms, which will make you feel better and make you a little bit more functional. And then with that extra functionality, what else can you do to kind of continue helping yourself get better? And, how do these antidepressants work, or the serotonin blocking antidepressants? Well, they block serotonin reuptake. That's what they do immediately. but it doesn't seem that you get a true clinical or a full therapeutic effect for 4 to 6 weeks later. So it seems that there's some type of genetic adaptation or neuroadaptation event that needs to occur. And what we think that event is a downregulation of serotonin receptors, and particularly serotonin 1A receptors. And this is linked essentially, now getting back into the kind of neuroscience side of things, this has been linked to mechanisms that we call passive coping mechanisms. So I sort of articulate this as sort of weathering the storm, so to speak, is that that you're in some stormy weather, you're getting beaten up, you're getting exposed. So it's kind of a way of buttoning down the hatches and making yourself kind of insulated, right? And the narrative, again, is very polarized. Psychotropic drugs and mental illness in general is very stigmatized. So, some patients experience this as an enhanced tolerance to stress. The things that bothered them, that trigger them, that were really causing large emotional reactions tend to be dampened down a bit, and this creates a lot more emotional stability for them. The flip side, or the sort of darker narrative, is that this drug is emotionally numbing me. I couldn't feel the range of feelings that I used to feel. So yeah, maybe I'm not, crying every day or feeling so panicked, but I also feel that I'm having issues with the same levels of joy that I was having. Maybe there were still times, people, places, events that brought a lot of joy, and it's noticed that has been dimmed a little bit as well. So
and sexual issues as well, right? For a lot of people on classical SSRIs, they end up having issues with their arousal or their erections or their sexuality.
Yeah, so sexual dysfunction is more of like a long-term type of side effect of those serotonin blocking reuptake antidepressants, and depends what source you look at, but it's pretty common. It's like a 20 to 30%er, right? So the majority of people still probably wouldn't experience that, but 20 or 30%, and obviously intimacy and sexual function is probably a very important outlet in different people's relationships, bringing joy to their lives, making them feel alive. So yeah, that's one aspect, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's a common chronic side effect of them, but I always tell people that, side effects are not guaranteed effects either, right? So there's a probability or a chance that type of thing will happen. So with the general serotonin blocking antidepressants, to kind of like summarize, I guess, is that we think that they sort of strengthen passive coping mechanisms, or the ability to tolerate difficult situations, but inherently the drugs aren't very linked with transformative types of changes. Now, if you're feeling better and you're functioning better, and you go out in the world and start a new exercise program and get a new therapist, there's a good chance that you're going to keep heading in the right direction. But the paradigm of therapy is essentially now you're taking this antidepressant on a daily type of basis. Overall, they work, but the effect size is usually small, so they don't get people really entirely where they want to go. And then depending on who you are, you can actually be very sensitive to stopping them as well. So sometimes people are on antidepressants long term, not necessarily because they're making them feel so much better, but because they've tried tapering a few times and run into very difficult problems tapering, and essentially have decided, well, that's just too rough to do, and so I'm just going to continue doing this. Whereas, right, the psychedelic, I guess I'll call it the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy paradigm, is much more, well, you don't take drugs chronically, you use drugs intermittently, psychedelic substances, and you're always using it in this kind of supervised therapeutic setting. And the narrative there is much more, well, these psychedelic substances and these sessions have the ability to get to the sort of root of things, or the etiology that made the person not well in the first place, and essentially heal that aspect of them. And so you can get, really robust and persistent types of results in the long term. And right, like cure, I don't know, sustained long-term remissions, sure. I also sort of think that psychedelics could just be symptom reducers and drastic symptom reducers for some period of time. And then, right, it's essentially, well, what do you do with that experience, and what are the kind of changes that you make? I think a lot of people that start psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies do their sessions in the trials, and they are much, much better than when they began. But I think a lot of people experience psychedelics as the first step on a path of self-discovery, of spirituality. And so maybe cleaning out the traumas of the past is what happens first, and they start to feel a lot better. But they tend to, I think, come back to psychedelics, not in a way that is abusive or overindulgent, but it's not really like they do these 1 to 3 sessions in the trial and then are cured forever and never even look at that type of therapeutic option ever again. Like, I don't think that's true either, right? So I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is that psychedelics seem to be much more robust, immediate, rapid, persistent as far as the symptom reductions that we see in trials. They probably do have this ability to catalyze transformative processes because they're very neuroplastic, whereas the SSRIs, are much more about weathering a storm and enhancing your kind of stress tolerance to difficult situations.
Something that just came up for me as you were talking has to do with, the idea that the very sort of paradigm behind each of these drugs tends to be different, or these sets of drugs. I'm thinking about a term, biological psychiatry, which is very rooted in sort of a physicalist look at consciousness and one's sort of psyche. I mean, from a modern use, not from a soul kind of reference. Which is that, like, there's a problem in your brain. Like, your consciousness, your awareness, your mind is a result of brain activity. And your brain is obviously not working properly. It's a physical organ with a physical problem. It needs a physical solution. We give you the drug. We fix the physical problem. That fixes. And then the result is, okay, you're not anxious all the time anymore. Great. Like, that's how we do things. Wherein psychedelics kind of have this sense of like you said, it's not so much about sort of utilizing substance to buffer or wait out the storm. It's about utilizing a substance to assist in a very psychological, emotional, eventually, and maybe right away, spiritual sort of remapping of one's sense of self in a way that helps to, as a result, reduce some of the negative symptoms. And then when I think about the sort of paradigmatic differences here between biological psychiatry and what appears to be the growing sort of psychedelic psychotherapy paradigm, I wonder how much psychedelic psychotherapy is suffering from an attempt to maintain some level of that sort of biological psychiatry paradigm in its description for use of legitimacy, rather than saying like, oh, we're treating depression with this drug called psilocybin and it assists in psychotherapy, but then recognizing that, no, the very fundamental essence of the lives that we're living and how we understand ourselves as human beings in the world, not as just individuals, but collectively as a part of history and time and the planet and all the rest, is defunct and broken and breaking us down deeper and deeper into ourselves. And we need to connect with something beyond whatever it is that we were given that is really just holding us down, be it the trauma of our individual life or the trauma of our individual life influenced by the society and the cultural history we're a part of, and to realign the way we show up in the world so that we're in alignment with something deeper, fuller, richer, more meaningful than what we were given. And at that point, this is no longer about drug-assisted psychotherapy. This is about remapping your very sense of self in the world. And that is not a problem with the functioning of the material of your brain.
Yeah, well, I would say you can definitely look at psychedelics from the physicalist perspective. And there are, the psilocybin and MDMA trials are the ones that are randomized, double-blinded, and really use this psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy protocol. But you can look and find some studies of ayahuasca acting as a rapid antidepressant and you read the manuscript and it literally says, we gave them ayahuasca in a room and there was no one else in the room. We monitored them remotely with a camera and we decided not to play music because we wanted to see what the drug would do by itself. 2 weeks later, they're still not depressed. So I believe that psychedelics do have an intrinsic physical effect on the brain. You can find upregulation of neurotrophic factors. You can find, spinogenesis in new neurons. You can find, changes to the default mode network acutely. And then, as it reorganizes. So I kind of think that psychedelics do have this physical healing effect on the brain and creates this window where you're a little less attached to the things that you were previously attached to. You're very plastic, and it's up to you to go out and remap that sense of self. So the analogy that I kind of like is, let's say you go into the garage with a flat tire. Right. You go into the clinic, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling down, and they pump up your tire. They give you a dose of psilocybin, and you go out of that garage and your tire is full. You're ready to go. You're feeling much better. But if the way you're living is driving on a road that's full of nails every single day, that tire is going to be flat again pretty soon. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of two things going on. It's like there's a physical effect of the drugs that are inflating your tire, but what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to, because how did that tire get flat in the first place? And, some people, maybe there is like truly some type of genetic thing where their monoamine oxidase just eat serotonin. They're always low in neurotransmitters and they've just always been low. I think by and far and the large part, because like you said, you started this question with biological psychiatry and the illnesses, depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, PTSD, these are essentially much more biopsychosocial types of illnesses. So sure, there's a biological paradigm operating, but that psychosocial piece of it is probably the iceberg under the water, right? Mm-hmm. And it's all those other things that you're talking about is sort of like remapping the sense of self. Who are you now? What habits have to go? What new habits have to be replaced? What relationships are good? What activities are I'm exercising huge amounts of cognitive dissonance and it's weighing me down. So yeah, I all love of these things together, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I love and I really appreciate the commentary you just offered there. Although it wasn't clear in what I had said just beforehand, although included in that is the recognition of and the brain's a physical organ and psychedelics are physical molecules and they have physical effects on the brain. And I think I lean more towards I'm not in the brain creates consciousness kind of thing, but I'm not really in the consciousness creates brain sort of thing. I'm a bit agnostic. I'm sort of like chicken and the egg. They're definitely correlated and the correlation is important to map, but also keeping in mind that in the long run, it's like the center of the self from which we move and where do we locate that in our understanding of reality. And then psychedelics can help us sort of restructure what that looks like internally, which of course also looks like a restructuring of brain activity, because anytime I'm doing a thing, I'm either reinforcing or altering the architecture by which my brain is connected and functions. And I think we would be foolish to try to throw out the value of taking, using a material lens to observe what's happening in the body and in the brain when we're having these experiences and making these changes.
That's right. Science has its tools, right? And neuroscience is a pretty physicalist type of discipline, overall. I still think that the neuroscientists that are doing this psychedelic research are probably open to other types of philosophies and thoughts about consciousness in general. But right, it's we have the tools that we can use to observe things, and so we use them, but to be so sure that that's truly the way it is part of the psychedelic mystery, I guess. Sure.
Yeah. Hanging on that mystery with a capital M. So let's not exactly shift gears, but sort of turn the corner here.
Yeah.
Because I want to talk to you about specifically a certain collection of psychedelics, how they work in the brain generally, and then go through the different list of psychotropics that are prescribed and what the interactions might be in the risk profiles and how we might mitigate those risk profiles if necessary at all. And so maybe to start off, I'd like a sense of what is happening in the brain with ayahuasca, mushrooms, MDMA, and ketamine each. Mushrooms / LSD, because they're pretty similar in the brain.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, like I would say that all of those psychedelics that you named, so the psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and ayahuasca, are all serotonergic in nature. So that's kind of what they all have in common. Psilocybin and LSD, I do think that they're fairly similar in that psilocybin is truly a tryptamine. LSD is an ergo compound, but you can find a tryptamine structure or backbone sort of embedded within that. And mechanistically, both of them bind serotonin receptors directly and aren't really known to do a whole lot else. LSD does bind dopamine receptors a little bit, but both of those are tryptamine psychedelics. They stimulate serotonin receptors, and probably the other thing that psilocybin and LSD have in common is that they're very physically safe drugs, in that there's very, very few psychoactive compounds that I can think of that you can take 100, possibly 1,000-fold overdose and you do not die. Really, LSD, psilocybin, and THC are sort of like the three that come to mind that might fit that type of bucket. So LSD, psilocybin, serotonin stimulators, fairly similar as far as their physical safety profile, and they have a pretty wide margin of safety, at least physically in overdose. Of course, you overdose, you could go to a extreme mental place. The experience could be extremely deep, scary, or traumatizing from that angle. But from the physical, like will you die or not, extremely rare with something like psilocybin or LSD, to the point where some people would say it's never happened. MDMA, this is a serotonergic amphetamine now, and amphetamines do have more of an overdose risk or toxicity compared to something like psilocybin or LSD. MDMA has a complex mechanism of action, but I would say that it's primarily related to releasing serotonin. So a couple of things, right? You've got your psilocybin LSD stimulating serotonin receptors, and you've got MDMA, which is more flooding the synapse or releasing serotonin. It also binds serotonin receptors a little bit. There's neurohormonal effects of MDMA, like the oxytocin release or vasopressin release. So again, it's a complicated mechanism. MDMA, because it's an amphetamine, also works on neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and dopamine. But we probably think that the serotonin release is the part that is, I guess, driving the bus as far as like most of the effect. And then you've got your ayahuasca, and ayahuasca is unique essentially because of the ayahuasca vine containing monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And monoamine oxidase inhibitors do drastically increase the risk of physical toxicities. So ayahuasca in of itself is probably, safer in overdose than something like MDMA, but you start mixing drugs with ayahuasca and it becomes physically dangerous kind of quickly depending on which drugs you're mixing. So the key to understanding interactions with ayahuasca, I think, is mostly around understanding that it has monoamine oxidase inhibitors in it, and that makes it unique as far as its kind of physical safety profile. As far as the psychedelic part of ayahuasca, DMT, is probably more similar to the psilocybin or LSD, and it's really the monoamine oxidase inhibitors that set it apart as far as the kind of physical interaction risks.
Mm-hmm. And then ketamine.
Yeah, so ketamine is sort of a different drug completely. It works mostly on glutamate receptors. Seems to also modulate opioid neurocircuitry a little bit, but it's mostly a glutamate modulator. I guess I will say that all like the tryptamine psychedelics and ketamine, are both known to converge in certain areas of the brain and both known to upregulate certain types of neurotrophic factors, and they actually share this with some other refractory things for depression, like electroconvulsive therapy or repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. It all seems that these sort of disparate modalities for treatment refractory types of psychiatric illnesses all upregulate neurotrophic factors, and particularly certain areas of the prefrontal cortex. So it's interesting that despite different mechanisms, maybe there is sort of some underlying convergence at the end of the day. But as far as their interaction profile, it's quite different with ketamine.
So just to be clear, neurotrophic factors are basically sort of like the building blocks needed to make changes physically in the brain.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, I mean, you start with like, you basically start with an undifferentiated cell. It's called a stem cell, right? That's what a stem cell is, like the holy grail of a cell, because you can supposedly make any other type of cell from it if you bathe it in the right type of factors, right? So these neurotrophic factors are things that cause neurons to differentiate into different types of neurons, and the ones that I think that we've seen the effect of is essentially an increase in connections, so spinogenesis, so existing neurons growing essentially a new connection with a neuron that it wasn't really talking to before. So it seems like those are the types of effects that these neurotrophic factors have in this scenario. But you can kind of think of it like let's say you have a seed, right? And you want to grow that seed. Well, you have to put certain factors in. You have to put water and maybe a certain blend of fertilizers to essentially get that robust, healthy plant at the end of the day. And so it's kind of like the right fertilizers, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And just to sort of further expand on that, when you talk about this, so we would say spinogenesis, the growing of new connections, this is what's referred to when someone will say that psychedelics are neuroplastic agents. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So they essentially create the potential for like real like morphological types of changes to occur. It's probably very specific regions of the brain, right? It's probably not like a whole like global thing where it's like, oh, I took a psychedelic and now every neuron is growing these new connections, and right. So it's probably limited to, pretty specific sets of neurons at different parts of the brain. But yeah, particularly with psilocybin and Johns Hopkins, they found this effect. Yeah.
When you said every part of the brain connecting, I thought about the film Limitless and the NZ-17 pill. I don't know if you saw it.
I haven't. It's been years. Yeah.
Yeah. We don't have to talk about it. I think the sort of like moral underpinnings of that show or that movie is pretty disgusting insofar as like the type of value it puts onto life and sort of like acquisition for personal gain and stuff. But anyways, let's move on. So now now that we have a sense of how each of these psychedelics category, and I feel like, no, I'll just leave that. I'd like to go into the different sort of classes of antidepressants. Yeah. And then I want you to go through and I can ask you step by step to keep us on track. First, starting, what are these antidepressants? Why are they this class? Generally, what is this class doing? What are some examples of this class? And then how do they interact with ayahuasca, mushrooms, LSD, MDMA, ketamine? Are those interactions dangerous? If they're dangerous, are they physically dangerous, psychologically dangerous? And should we taper off them or avoid combining them at all? Cool. All right. So starting with tricyclic antidepressants or tetracyclic antidepressants, the TCAs and the TCEAs. What is this class of antidepressants, and what are some examples?
Well, the tetracyclic ones are almost never used, and even the tricyclic ones at this point are essentially older types of antidepressants. And so they work similarly to newer types of antidepressants in that we think that their mechanisms are mostly related to blocking serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake. Some examples, probably the two most common tricyclic antidepressants that are prescribed are amitriptyline or nortriptyline. And there is an actual over-the-counter medicine for cough and cold called chlorpheniramine, which is actually structurally a tricyclic antidepressant and pharmacologically behaves like one too, even though it's available over-the-counter as an antihistamine. And maybe that's a good segue, because the tricyclics, beyond blocking serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake, which we think was linked to their sort of mood enhancing effects, they also block histamine receptors, so they tend to be sedating. They block cholinergic receptors, so they tend to cause dry mouth, dry eyes, urinary retention, constipation, and even some sort of cognitive blunting in long-term types of situations. So anticholinergic, dry everything, dry mouth, dry eyes, I can't pee, I can't poop. Like it just basically sucks all the fluids out, right? And then it also blocks adrenergic receptors. And when you block these receptors, you tend to get a problem called orthostasis, or essentially dizziness when you go from laying to sitting or sitting to standing. And if the dizziness is bad, you can actually pass out. And you can understand if you pass out, fall down, and hit your head, well, that's a pretty serious type of thing now. The tricyclics also aren't very safe in overdose. They can cause some cardiac arrhythmias and things like that. And if you're treating severe depression, people that are suicidal, you're always looking for a drug to give them that is not toxic in overdose, because the last thing you want to do is give somebody a means to a completed suicide. So with all of that said, there's not really very much known about the interaction of tricyclic antidepressants and psychedelics. On the one hand, you would sort of predict them to behave similarly to the serotonin blocking antidepressants that are the newer ones that almost everyone's taking. However, there's one older observational study from the late 90s that actually says with psilocybin that people reported more types of effects occurring. And it's a very non-specific paper as far as like what more types of effects mean, whether that was a really challenging and horrible type of effect, or whether that was like a psychedelic enhancing effect, and what type of scales were they using to measure these effects, or was it, well, after the experience, did this feel potent compared to some other time you ate mushrooms and weren't on your antidepressant, right? So I would say that the tricyclics are kind of unknown, really, but I would sort of predict them to be similar to those serotonin blocking types of antidepressants that are more common.
Is there any particular comment you want to make about the TCAs around ketamine and MDMA being that and ayahuasca? Because ayahuasca has the added MAOI effect. MDMA is a releasing agent, also a stimulant. Ketamine's just like a whole different ballgame. Yeah.
So with, I mean, let's just maybe ketamine's the low hanging fruit, because I really think of it as sort of like it's the one that is pretty compatible with most types of psychotropic substances, including the antidepressants, universally. So ketamine is a great option if you're taking antidepressants or not ready to taper, but aren't feeling the greatest and want to try something that is probably going to have a good effect for you. Ketamine is a great option. With ayahuasca, there's less out there about serotonin syndrome and tricyclic antidepressants compared to like the SSRIs, for example, which you haven't really talked about yet, but I would still not recommend combining them. And there's probably maybe even a hierarchy within those, because really it's the serotonin reuptake blocking piece that is the most critical for danger with these antidepressants and ayahuasca, as far as risk of severe physical toxicities like serotonin syndrome. Oh man, I totally forgot. Lost my train of thought there. So I guess what I'm saying is that the tricyclics and ayahuasca, I just wouldn't mix them. I just wouldn't do it. With the ketamine, it's probably compatible and probably still going to get benefit. With MDMA or psilocybin or LSD, I would predict that it's actually a decreased type of effect. But like I said, there's that one observational study from the late 90s that's sort of arguing against that and saying, well, with tricyclic antidepressants, we observed more effect.
Okay, so let's
clear as mud.
let's step on to the next one, which is we've been talking about, or you've been talking about in your reference to ayahuasca, which is monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, which are themselves a class of antidepressants.
Right. Yeah. So how do MAOIs act?
I think then the question specifically is we're kind of, it's all sort of building on itself is like, what are MAOIs? How do they work? And then also add into that, maybe, there's a lot of talk about the difference between an MAOI A and a B, and sort of weave that in as well before talking about possible interactions.
Yeah. Okay. So monoamine oxidase is an enzyme, and what that means is that it does metabolic things. It changes molecules in your body. That's what an enzyme does, right? And it's a metabolic or breakdown type of enzyme, and it's found in a few different places throughout the body. So there's a large store of it in your gastrointestinal system, your small intestine, as well as your liver, and it's probably there to metabolize things that are coming from your diet that could potentially have a toxic effect, like tyramine, for example. You can get hypertensive types of reactions, right? So you have probably monoamine oxidase in your gut to play this sort of defense role from things that you're ingesting in your diet. The other place monoamine oxidase is found is the space between two nerves or two neurons in the synaptic cleft. Also found a little bit in the presynaptic terminal, but the synaptic cleft, I think, is where people most classically think about monoamine oxidase being found. And its role here is, again, metabolism, but it's metabolism of neurotransmitters. And the kind of big neurotransmitters that monoamine oxidase metabolizes are serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Now, you mentioned monoamine oxidase A and B. So there's two different varieties or two different flavors of monoamine oxidase out there. You have monoamine oxidase B, which is much less implicated in severe physical toxicities and much more implicated in the realm of Parkinson therapeutics. So there's specific monoamine oxidase B inhibitors like rasagiline, that just block monoamine oxidase B and are used in Parkinson's. You also have drugs like selegiline, which is a monoamine oxidase B inhibitor that's used in lower doses in Parkinson's, but also sometimes used in depression in higher doses. And then you have monoamine oxidase A inhibitors. And it's the monoamine oxidase A inhibitors that are truly the ones that have the severe risks of drug interactions and probably leading to serotonin syndrome, because monoamine oxidase A is the one that's responsible for metabolizing serotonin. So that's a little about monoamine oxidase. Now, monoamine oxidase inhibitors are, as the name sounds, drugs that inhibit that metabolic enzyme, monoamine oxidase. And monoamine oxidase inhibitors also come in a few different flavors, right? So I mentioned monoamine oxidase B inhibitors, rasagiline and selegiline in Parkinson's, more dopamine types of stuff. But the original antidepressants, the first pharmaceutical antidepressants that were approved on the market, were monoamine oxidase A and B inhibitors. So they were non-selective. They inhibited both of them. And they were what we call irreversible. So they bind to this monoamine oxidase, this metabolic enzyme, and essentially form a complex with the enzyme that knocks the enzyme's activity out. So the only way that that enzyme can restore metabolic capacity, or your body can restore metabolic capacity, is to make new enzymes, which takes time. That's a genetic type of thing. It has to make new ones. So it takes a couple weeks to do that. So whenever you read about monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and particularly irreversible monoamine oxidase inhibitors, essentially they're always talking about, well, if you stop the monoamine oxidase inhibitor, you have to wait 2 weeks before starting some other serotonin drug. And that's essentially the amount of time that you need to restore enough metabolic capacity and make new monoamine oxidase. So that's your pharmaceutical ones, irreversible and non-selective inhibitors of monoamine oxidase A and B. Now, in ayahuasca, it has harmala alkaloids, sometimes called beta-carbolines. Examples of these are harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, also found in Syrian rue or peganum harmala. And these are selective for monoamine oxidase A, which means that there is a real risk of those serotonin types of drug interactions, because monoamine oxidase A is the player that is breaking down serotonin in the body. But they're reversible inhibitors of monoamine oxidase A, meaning that you probably could drink ayahuasca in a much shorter period, 48 or 72 hours later, your metabolic capacity would be restored. And I don't think it would be my advice, but you could ingest some other serotonergic drug at that period and not be at risk of some life-threatening toxicity. Now, before ayahuasca, you still have to worry about it, because before ayahuasca, it's the drug that's leaving your system that's in question, right? I don't know if this is making sense. There's essentially, you've got a period of time where monoamine oxidase is inhibited. And then after that, you're waiting for the monoamine oxidase inhibitors to leave your system with ayahuasca, which is a short type of event, 48, 72 hours, maybe even less, depending on who you are and how much you drink over several nights and things like that. But before ayahuasca, it still may be weeks or longer, because the antidepressant that you're coming from or the contraindicated medication you're coming from could stay in the body for a whole lot longer. I'm not sure if that was...
No, that sounds very clear, because then, you're still on some level, you're having the potential effect of these drugs in your system. And so when you take the ayahuasca, it could boost those drugs' effects. And then all of a sudden it can interact in a way that leads to serotonin syndrome, which, correct, if I understand correctly, is basically you're poisoning your brain with its own serotonin, and it causes a variety of symptoms, and people end up dying of hyperthermia oftentimes, because their body can't regulate its own temperature so much so that it basically like melts your brain.
That's right. So serotonin syndrome is like a severe serotonin syndrome does have it's like a clinical criteria. It's a syndrome, right? So there's a criteria to define it. And one of the things is hyperthermia or extreme temperatures or fevers. Another is sort of like seizure activity or like myoclonic types of seizures. And then the third is essentially mental status changes. And it's usually, the person becomes agitated and combative, or maybe even comatose or confused if it's like a severe type of case. But serotonin syndrome is at the extreme end, probably a spectrum of serotonin excesses. And, some of those things might truly be adverse and poisoning. But, most psychedelics, right, they boost serotonin neurotransmission for some period of time. So it's very interesting in that some enhanced serotonin signaling seems to be therapeutic, either if you're going to take an SSRI and wait 6 weeks, or you're going to take a psychedelic and experience it for 6 hours. Both of those things increased or enhanced serotonin neurotransmission, right? But on the extreme end, you can poison yourself with serotonin and end up with a life-threatening toxicity. And kind of the monoamine oxidase inhibitors are key players in putting yourself at risk or being vulnerable for that type of thing. So I don't want to make ayahuasca sound so toxic and scary, because when you avoid these interacting drugs, it actually is pretty safe. But that's just it. There's just has to be a greater awareness around the interacting drugs, and after that, your risk is probably not that high.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about the MAOIs and ayahuasca, sort of the interactions. Yeah. Obviously, you don't want to be adding more MAOIs. Certainly not irreversible, clinical, non-selective MAOIs to your ayahuasca experience. But then let's talk about their interactions. And we're talking about clinical MAOIs, but we could also talk about things like SARI and RU with LSD and psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine. Because from what MAOI in the ayahuasca vine basically serves to be its own experience, but also to boost the effects of orally ingested DMT to the point where it actually has an impact on your brain, that you could actually have an experience where otherwise if you just drank it, your gut would just like rip it apart and be like, no, sorry, you don't get no fun here. And so similarly, there could be a significant boosting effect on certainly mushrooms, the psilohuasca premise. But then is that the case for LSD as well? And in increasing the effects of mushrooms and LSD through MAOIs, be them clinical, irreversible, or otherwise, are you increasing or presenting yourself with the risks that otherwise would not be there?
Yeah. So I don't think there's like a whole lot of like controlled research about like monoamine oxidase inhibitors plus psilocybin, and like, do you really, what are the blood pressure changes there? Are you really like increasing the physical risks? not really sure. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors actually drop your blood pressure. So, I mean, if you look at Rick Strassman's IV DMT experience, when he just shoots people up with IV DMT, some of the people have heart rates that go from 80 to 150. You know, we're talking 60, 70 beat per minute increases. Some of them didn't. Some of them went from 80 to 90. They didn't even break 100, which is interesting in of itself, right? But with ayahuasca, the heart rate and blood pressure changes seem to be much, much, much smaller. It's probably because monoamine oxidase inhibitors actually decrease blood pressure. I would say that monoamine oxidase inhibitors and psychedelics in some ways seem pretty straightforward and other ways seem like kind of mysterious, right? So with your classic tryptamine psychedelics, which I would say are LSD, psilocybin, and DMT, it seems like acute, like one-time ingestion of monoamine oxidase inhibitors boosts those experiences, particularly DMT, ayahuasca, yes, and I suspect LSD as well. However, there is data, you know, from the olden days, 60s and 70s, of people chronically taking those pharmaceutical monoamine oxidase inhibitors and taking psychedelics, and almost nothing happens. Right? So it's probably, again, has to do with neuroadaptation events, is that you're taking a monoamine oxidase inhibitor chronically, the amount of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine is boosted chronically. The brain gets smart and says, well, we have more neurotransmitters, so maybe let's decrease the amount of receptors that we have. And we don't have any receptors. Well, psychedelics need those receptors to work. So maybe chronically taking monoamine oxidase inhibitors would actually decrease the effects of those tryptamine psychedelics. Whereas if you're taking something like ayahuasca, which is much more of like a one-time or maybe over a couple of days, it seems like it enhances, preserves, and makes it, orally bioavailable. So DMT normally wouldn't work by mouth, but like you said, when you mix it with ayahuasca vine, it does work by mouth. It becomes psychoactive. I think that's great.
So then what would be the risk here? You know, my inclination now is to immediately assume that, you know, mixing MAOIs and MDMA is just like an immediate no-go.
Yes.
Would you say the same?
Correct. Yeah. So with MDMA, because it's a serotonin releaser, right? It increases the amount of serotonin that you have in your neuronal space, in the synapse. The classic tryptamines don't do that. Psilocybin, LSD, DMT, they do not increase the amount of serotonin you have. So how are you going to poison yourself with serotonin syndrome when you're taking drugs that don't increase the amount of serotonin that's available? Whereas monoamine oxidase inhibitors, well, they block serotonin breakdown. So yeah, you bet that increases your amount of intrasynaptic serotonin. MDMA releases serotonin. So that also increases intrasynaptic serotonin. So two drugs that increase intrasynaptic serotonin are typically contraindicated. And the big classes that are contraindicated with monoamine oxidase inhibitors are releasers, like MDMA is probably a pretty classic one. You know, even strong stimulants like amphetamine or cocaine's not a releaser, but strong stimulants and things like MDMA that release serotonin. And then the other one is serotonin reuptake inhibitors, those antidepressants, because they block serotonin reuptake, which also increases the amount of serotonin in the synapse. So serotonin syndrome, there's some kind of wacky and idiosyncratic types of reports out there, but by and large, it's pretty predictable in that you mix a monoamine oxidase inhibitor with a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Those two drugs both increase intrasynaptic serotonin and can put you at risk of a serious toxicity. You mix a monoamine oxidase inhibitor with a serotonin releaser like MDMA. Both of those increase intrasynaptic serotonin, so you're going to have this risk of toxicity. Whereas those classic tryptamines, they don't do that. They are, pretty safe even in overdose types of settings. So I want
to quickly jump in on this.
Please go ahead.
Before you get into ketamine, which is, monoamine oxidase breaks down all the monoamines, which also includes dopamine and norepinephrine, which are the primary sort of site of activity for stimulants like amphetamine, be it or methylphenidate, be it like a releaser or a reuptake inhibitor. And so would it be fair to also say that you shouldn't mix MAOIs with stimulants that are having that effect on the brain?
Yes. Yeah. So serotonin, right, is probably the most classic one. And I mean, if you mixed a drug that doesn't release serotonin with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, would you get serotonin syndrome? Probably not, because you don't have an excess of serotonin. But like you're saying, they also block or monoamine oxidase inhibitors and monoamine oxidase A inhibitors, block the breakdown of norepinephrine and dopamine to an extent as well. Dopamine has that second out, right? It has monoamine oxidase B. But things like cocaine, really strong things like methamphetamine that release a lot of norepinephrine and dopamine or really block dopamine reuptake strongly, you probably don't run so much risk of serotonin syndrome, but you run risk of hypertensive crisis, a stroke due to extremely high blood pressures. Amphetamine does block serotonin reuptake inhibit a bit, so you're probably still going to run into the seizures and the hyperthermia. But like, is your problem purely serotonin excess there? Probably not. You're probably dopamine and norepinephrine excess. But the result at the end of the day is you're still at risk for a severe physical toxicity, which is probably what the listenership cares about most.
Right. So the underline here is like MAOIs and stims are a pretty much immediate no-go. Do not pass. You will not collect $200.
Yeah.
So then what about now? And maybe it doesn't even make sense to keep asking you about ketamine in this regard, because you had said ketamine is relatively safe with all things. And does this continue to apply with MAOIs as well?
Yeah. I don't know if like relatively safe with all things could be like a stretch, but yeah, with MAOIs and ketamine, there wouldn't really be a mechanism that I'm aware of where it could cause a severe physical type of toxicity purely from that type of combination.
Yeah, with all things, I also recognize to be a stretch, because I mean, mixing ketamine with alcohol.
Refractory depression, and you were on, those standard pharmaceutical monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you would still be eligible for ketamine.
Great, but then just a comment as well to add, but you wouldn't want to mix ketamine with things that depress the nervous system in some way or another, because it could be dangerous. Like, for example, I know that alcohol, you wouldn't want to mix it with GHB. You wouldn't want to mix it with, I assume, also things like, we're not going to talk about these, but like benzos, you probably wouldn't want to mix it with. Is that kind of fair as well?
I think it's fair to say that if you're going out for the night with ketamine, yeah, probably drinking, mixing it with the GHB, taking a bunch of Xanax along with it, taking some heavy duty opioids with it. Yeah, you might be at risk for passing out, vomiting while you're passed out, asphyxiating, respiratory depression, things like that. But if you're someone that takes, half a milligram of lorazepam, nightly to help you go to sleep, is that going to disqualify you from getting around to ketamine or something? Probably not. Right. So, the only thing that determines whether a drug is helpful or a poison is the dose. I mean, there's more to it than that, but kind of father of pharmacology, Paracelsus, that's his quote. Is sort of, he has a much more poetic way of saying it, but he's pretty much saying that the only thing that determines something is helpful or poison is dose. So, yeah. So
then here we are. We're at like the big game now on some level, because these are the most common. But SSRIs. Let's get a sense of, you've talked around it a lot, obviously.
Yeah. So I've alluded to them.
Yeah. How do they work?
While, yeah. So the SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So as the name implies or suggests, they're fairly selective for blocking the reuptake of serotonin. What that means is that once serotonin is released, it needs to go back up into the nerve that it came from. There's a pump on that nerve. It's called the serotonin reuptake pump, and these drugs block that pump. So that's what it means. Examples. You've got probably your big five is citalopram or Celexa, escitalopram or Lexapro, paroxetine or Paxil, sertraline or Zoloft, and then the original Prozac or fluoxetine. Those are probably your biggest five types of SSRIs. The sort of genesis of reuptake blocking antidepressants has gone beyond SSRIs, though. So we also have the SNRIs. So these are serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And overall, they're pretty similar to SSRIs. yet they also block norepinephrine reuptake a little bit. So your kind of two big examples there are venlafaxine or Effexor, or duloxetine or Cymbalta. There's a couple of newer antidepressants that have come out that they say are SPARI, so serotonin partial agonists and reuptake inhibitors, and mostly a serotonin reuptake blocking antidepressant. Again, these ones do have some ability to stimulate certain types of serotonin receptors as well. But for most intents and purposes, I would probably categorize them pretty similar to the SSRIs, like kind of in my mind. So lots of antidepressants that block serotonin reuptake. There's even some examples of drugs just from disparate areas of therapeutics that may also do that. But those are the biggest ones.
Mm-hmm. And so then what is the interaction danger? I mean, starting, with the sort of classic tryptamines, from what I understand, the danger primarily is not serotonin syndrome, but it's actually that you just won't get any effect at all. Is that correct?
As far as I know, right. Well, I would say that, yes, you're correct in that you're not going to get the serotonin syndrome, right? There's like I've looked at the literature over and over again. I just cannot find a single case report of someone that was on mushrooms that tried some antidepressants that wound up in the hospital or had a serious toxicity. And that's pretty consistent with mushrooms in general. So I can say with a pretty high degree of confidence that there's no like life-threatening toxicity between those classic tryptamines and the serotonin blocking reuptake antidepressants. As far as diminished effects, yeah, it does seem that it blunts subjective effects of psychedelics. It seems like it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some people are saying, well, I ate 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms and I was on my paroxetine or Paxil and nothing happened. I just got tired and took a nap. Other people are saying, well, I was on my SSRI Lexapro and I started microdosing and it was hugely beneficial for my mood. So, how some people are getting, really good clinical effects from, minuscule doses, and other people are taking, what our, pal Terrence would call a heroic dose and experiencing almost nothing. There's obviously some kind of mystery there. And, maybe it has to do with some individual things, how long they're taking the antidepressants. We'll have to wait for the data to kind of like understand a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Well, one possible factor, of course, is like genomic factors of metabolism, which generally isn't being tested in the scientific research. Like, what are the genetic variations, and then mapping those and then adding them into a database that can go back and like look for those things later. So that could be quite a substantial factor that is just currently not so available because of, I assume, like cost, and also the research wanting to stay particularly clean, and that it's not woven into the medical infrastructure or institutions at this point to be tracking genomic factors in people when prescribing medicines or getting results from those medicines. Yeah,
not quite yet. Not in like standard clinical trials. There has been some genomic work done, particularly with things like CYP2D6 and MDMA. But yeah, less with the classic tryptamines. What else was I going to say about that?
So let's move on, unless it comes back, then weave it in as appropriate. Yeah. You had already said it, which is basically, so we don't necessarily have to go over it again, which is like SSRIs, ayahuasca. Ayahuasca's got an MAOI, not a good scene. Yeah. Don't do it. So we just leave that there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think I want to ask you then about MDMA, and ketamine. But before I do, you mentioned a bunch of different varieties of SSRIs there. In regards to psilocybin or LSD, does the variety make a difference? If we kind of know, like, okay, chances are you won't have a serotonin syndrome on an SSRI, but are some of these other sort of like different, like the partial agonists, something that I didn't know the word. Is there any potential risk there in the unknown that would lead you to say, well, it's probably just best not to combine it at all?
Probably not. I really think that they're similar enough that you're going to find, for the most part, that that they do similar things. You might find for some reason at some point in time, like, hey, like for whatever reason on this SSRI, people still get a pretty decent effect, but I highly doubt you're going to find, well, this SSRI and this classic tryptamine psychedelic is toxic. Because, I mean, these SSRI, I mean, Prozac came out, I think, in like 88 or 89. You know, psilocybin, LSD, I mean, psilocybin, the beginning of time, really, but LSD, even, you know, decades and decades of people taking it. You know, we live in a prohibition world where there's all sorts of incentives to report harms about illicit or illegal drugs rather than benefits. And, you know, you go to the medical literature and it's just absolutely crickets. You know, it's like, okay, some controlled data will help us understand the sort of nuances of that interaction and the detail. But like, is there going to be some gross bogeyman reaction where, you know, people are really at risk of a serious life-threatening reaction? I would kind of highly doubt it. So with the things like psilocybin, MDMA, or no, I should say psilocybin and LSD, like the classic tryptamines, where it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Some people say they're getting an effect, some people aren't, right? It's sort of difficult to say, well, you should taper off your antidepressant or you shouldn't taper off your antidepressant, because the reality is that everyone's just at a different place with their antidepressant. They coming to the antidepressant with a different history and different set of symptoms. And then there's also a lot of individual variability as far as their sensitivity to withdrawal. So in the face of not knowing, hey, well, the psilocybin doesn't work, or you're not going to get anything good out of this. I mean, there was real risks to saying you should stop or taper off or attempt discontinuing antidepressant for some people. So it's hard to say, like, well, I mean, truly, in an ideal world, it sort of seems like it would be optimal to try to taper off and have some, period of weeks to months sort of washed out. But not everyone can do that. Not everyone is feeling well enough to do that, which sort of opens the door up to, well, gosh, like, if it blunted the experience 30% and they still got 70% of the benefit, and there were some serious risks or reasons why you weren't wanting to taper off your antidepressant right now, maybe it would be the correct thing to do to actually continue, particularly with something like psilocybin that is a physically safe type of drug and still might have a pretty good effect. MDMA and the SSRIs, though, is a little bit more fleshed out. And I'm going to kind of go back on my rule a little bit, right? Because MDMA and those serotonin blocking antidepressants both increase intrasynaptic serotonin. So earlier in the conversation, I basically said when you mix two drugs that increase intrasynaptic serotonin, you run into a serious toxicity. But that's not the case with MDMA and the antidepressants. And it's because, how does MDMA release serotonin? It releases serotonin through that reuptake pump, but the reuptake pump is blocked. So it's kind of like MDMA normally, it's like turning on a faucet and there's serotonin coming out of the faucet. But, with an SSRI on board, there's a plug in the bottom of the sink. The serotonin can't go anywhere. It can't escape. So it essentially falls flat on its face, and it really diminishes the effect. And this is something that they have done a series of probably a half dozen experiments with different serotonin blocking antidepressants. Some of them Paxil, some of them citalopram, even an SSRI like Effexor or venlafaxine. And they all just universally greatly diminish the effects of MDMA. So not physically toxic, but we're pretty sure that the MDMA is not going to be that helpful if you were going to assume, right, that the subjective experience is what's helping people, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, a good assumption, but is something that also, people are interested in investigating and, should investigate too.
One thing that had come up, I had interviewed Emmanuel Speros, who was one of the originators of Dance Safe and has been a huge contributor for harm reduction around MDMA use and sort of like advocating for MDMA as a medicine, and MDMA sort of like his whole like hashtag drug positive thing, which is like, yeah, let's reduce harm, but let's also optimize benefits, because the reality is like, yeah, we don't want to get sick and all the rest, but also, right, we're doing it if it's outside clinical setting, we're also doing it because we want what's good from it. So let's also just embrace the fact that we can have fun and enjoy ourselves too. Yeah. And he had mentioned, I had said to him that, and this hasn't been a problem recently, so it might have been a time in my life thing, or time in my development thing, which is that I would have MDMA and then I would just be like a wreck for a week, right? Mm-hmm. Be it MDMA toxicity, be it sort of, just like a lack of serotonin, like rebuilding capacity. Mm-hmm. And he had suggested something along the lines of like, for a small set of people, the MDMA gets stuck in the cert gate, which I think is this pump that you were talking about, and doesn't release the same or something like that. So it's basically, I can't refill my levels. And that if I were to take, fluoxetine, Prozac, as the MDMA was coming down, that Prozac itself has a higher affinity for that same site. So if there is MDMA in there, it would kick it out and take its place and then stop the MDMA from being able to continue and have an effect. Now, I could be remembering this wrong. So I would love for you to clarify, but is that something that sounds reasonable? Because there is some discussion about how, for people who have a heavy come down from MDMA, whatever it might be, that taking fluoxetine in particular at the end of your role, like as you're, getting ready to go to bed or whatever, might help to mitigate the effects, the after effects of having taken MDMA. Is there any commentary you have on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's not a great, again, there's not a whole lot of like great research, but it does seem that because MDMA and neurotoxicity has been a thing, and been a controversial thing and been something where I think we've kind of settled on the fact that, well, yeah, MDMA probably is neurotoxic, but again, what dose are you taking and in what kind of context and circumstances? MDMA, when it's mixed with other drugs like alcohol or amphetamine, it seems to increase the neurotoxicity of it. How is MDMA neurotoxic? Well, some people, it's like it releases serotonin. It's just a gross serotonin releasing effect, right? And so from that perspective, right, if you just added an SSRI after the peak of the experience, maybe that would diminish the amount of serotonin depletion that ultimately happens, and there would be some neuroprotective effect. I'm not really convinced that's a great strategy overall, though. I think that, they've done MDMA up to like 187.5 milligrams in some people, 125 and a booster of 62.5 in the clinical trials. And, some people do report some sleep disturbances, some anxiety, some low mood, some difficulty concentrating in the week afterwards, but it seems pretty transient to the week afterwards. And by and large, they're still reporting that their PTSD was a whole lot better. So I've kind of looked into this MDMA neurotoxicity thing quite a bit, and it seems to me that it's mostly associated with large doses, frequent doses, like every weekend, taking the third pill, right? So it seems okay, one and then, a smaller booster. Okay, but you start 1, 2, 3 pills, 4 pills throughout the night. You start stacking these things. You're mixing it with other things like alcohol. Typically MDMA in a recreational or I don't know if there's a typical recreational setting, but let's just say MDMA in a nightlife setting, you're oftentimes staying up very, very late. You're doing it on a Friday, Saturday night. Maybe you're going to bed at a different time during the week. So there's like a huge circadian disruption that's happening from staying up all night as well. And I kind of feel that instead of, well, I'm going to take 3 pills and just take Prozac on my come down, or I'm going to take 3 pills and drink like I normally do, and then in the week afterwards I'm just going to load up on 5-HTP, right? Is another one that's sort of like, well, that could rebuild your serotonin store, so you should supplement 5-HTP afterwards, is like another strategy I hear about. I think more like, well, as pure substance as you can, try to not disrupt your circadian rhythm to the extent you can. Absolutely avoid alcohol and other amphetamines with it. And you're probably just not going to land in this place where you're just feeling crummy and in the pits for days and days and days. Could there be some emotional rawness, some more sadness? You took a stimulant, so some post-use fatigue, things like that. Sure. But when, especially, talking about psychedelics and sort of optimizing their benefits, you're usually also talking to people about, well, hey, after you have this big life-changing experience, like maybe you want to not rush into the office right the very next thing the next day. Maybe you want to give yourself some more space there to sort of think about things and feel whatever you're going through. So my sort of like counseling, I guess, or advice around it would be that, yeah, MDMA depletes serotonin. We know from clinical trials that this is not a deal breaker. We know that people still get a whole lot better. We know that it can affect people in the week afterwards. So as you go through this journey and go through this process, you should plan to feel a little lower and you should plan to feel a little raw. And, you should give yourself the space for that to sort of unfold in the few days afterwards. And like, I would rather steer people that route than kind of the route of, well, let's mitigate the risk by adding a Prozac on the back end,
this makes perfect sense. And then additionally to that, it's like, of course, just take lower doses, and if a person is taking higher doses and going really intensely, like one thing is like, of course, harm reduction is to try to educate people that generally this is not a good idea for multiple reasons. But if someone's taking really big doses of MDMA, and messing with their circadians and all the rest, like I get it. I've done that. It's a hell of fun. It's got its benefits, but it also has its drawbacks. And those drawbacks, really, that's not a problem with the MDMA. Right. That's not like, I need to find a way to stop the MDMA from hurting me. It's like, no, I need to consider what it is I'm doing to myself so that I'm not using MDMA to hurt myself, or, prepare myself in a way that I'm willing to deal with the consequences. And like you said, don't recommend it. Maybe Prozac is a way that someone tries to deal with those consequences. But if you're at that point, I think there's a reason to look a lot deeper into yourself about why you're making the choices that you are making. Yeah.
And I mean, hey, like, SSRIs, when you start them, and the counseling in the first week or even the first month is that, well, hey, this drug boosts serotonin. It could give you a little nausea. It could give you a headache. It could give you some insomnia. So it's sort of like, okay, Prozac is also known to be the most activating antidepressant. So it's 3 a.m. You're coming home from your night out and you want to kind of go to sleep. And the idea is to take this super activating antidepressant that you've never ingested before. I don't know. To me, I can't see it being that great of a strategy.
Mm-hmm. And fair enough. Like I might have described this strategy poorly. Based on
like,
my
it's
memory
out there because MDMA neurotoxicity has been such a thing that there have been people, particularly in rodent experiments, they did this, and they were kind of like, Prozac protects against the neurotoxicity of MDMA. And then I think some people sort of extrapolated from that kind of preclinical rodent data and was kind of like, well, I'm going to start doing this because, I go out every single weekend. I'm a DJ and I, take MDMA very frequently and often take, 300-400 milligrams in a night. And so I think I need it. Right.
So before we move on to the last two things, this is deep, it's rich, it's complex, it's very full, and there's a lot to chew on. And there's still just a couple more things I want to ask you. I think given the time, we'll probably let go the discussion about stimulants, although, I still have a lot of excitement for it. It's also a lot of information already, and we're coming up on our time soon. So let's just finish off with these last two sort of classes of antidepressants. But before we do, is there any commentary you want to make around the combination of SSRIs and ketamine?
Not particularly, except for ketamine still works. It should still work, and there's not really a whole lot of data that would suggest that it shouldn't still work. When ketamine was studied originally, they washed people out of antidepressants when they were doing their IV infusions of ketamine. With a nasal spray, they required people to be on antidepressants. So we have data both ways, and it seems that ketamine works.
Cool. All right. So let's move on to NRIs and NDRIs. If you could talk about what they are.
Yeah, so the NDRIs are something like bupropion or Wellbutrin, a dopamine norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And the NRI is just a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So this is probably atomoxetine or Strattera. So very similar strategy, right? You're still boosting neurotransmitters, and you're still boosting neurotransmitters through blocking neurotransmitter reuptake. But instead of focusing on serotonin, now you're focused on either dopamine and norepinephrine or purely norepinephrine. I guess another NDRI out there you could say would be Ritalin or methylphenidate. It's probably a stronger version of Wellbutrin. And then even cocaine is more like, it's almost like a pure dopamine reuptake blocker, very, very short acting, very, very potent, right? So, I mean, that's not like an approved therapeutic agent for depression, right? So I'd sort of say like that's sort of outside.
Freud might disagree, but sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So those are what those are. And I guess as far as like your next question is probably like, well, how they interact with all those psychedelics that we talked about. I'll start with ketamine again and say like it's probably not very much interaction. With the serotonergic antidepressants, I think there'd be less, right? Like Wellbutrin, bupropion, or atomoxetine, or Strattera, should still have pretty good effects with, or things like psilocybin, LSD should have pretty good effects with those dopamine or norepinephrine blocking types of antidepressants. There's not a whole lot of reports of real severe toxicities mixing things like Strattera or atomoxetine, or mixing things like Wellbutrin with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, but I still think it's kind of a sketchy combination to the point where, there's just not enough information, I think, about ayahuasca and these things to say that like it's safe, or I know that it's safe. I would just say that compared relative to the serotonin blocking reuptake antidepressants, the risk is probably less. But I wouldn't say that it's like ketamine. It's kind of like, okay, I don't see any issue there. The stronger the reuptake blocking effect, probably the more contraindicated would be with ayahuasca. So your methylphenidate or Ritalin is probably getting really into the sort of like orange zone now, where some sources do say that there's been cases of people on monoamine oxidase inhibitors that have started very small doses of Ritalin and titrated it up slowly, and they've been okay. But that's just not the way ayahuasca is done, right? You take a cup of it, maybe another cup of it, maybe. So just clinically, it seems like a different thing where I probably wouldn't mix something like Ritalin or methylphenidate with ayahuasca. And I certainly wouldn't mix pure cocaine with ayahuasca. If you chewed a coca leaf 4 hours ago and now you're going to drink some ayahuasca, you're probably okay there, right? But snorting cocaine and using ayahuasca is a bad idea. Yeah.
I thought it was great. So much fun. Like do a little line, throw a little vomit. I'm just kidding. Sorry, I'm making light of a serious
this is a good comment though. This is a good comment though, because oftentimes you'll find discrepancy between like what I'm saying or what the scientific literature says and then what people actually report. So like one of these is 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, where you can go to Arrowwood and find reports of people that combined it. You can go to 5-MeO forums, and for the most part, people are going to be like, this is a contraindication. But every now and again, you're like, not in my book. I do 5-MeO 6 hours after ayahuasca. I've done that 20 times. It's the most profound, amazing thing ever. And so you're full of crap. And it's kind of like, well, again, a physical toxicity, that's more like an adverse drug reaction than a side effect. But it's still not necessarily a guaranteed effect for every single person. It's like you do this and you will die, right? It's sort of like you have a chance of dying, which is bad enough already. So just don't do it, right? But it's just a chance. So maybe monoamine oxidase inhibitors and 5-MeO DMT have, I don't know, I'm just going to make some numbers up. Maybe there's a 5% chance of something severe happening. Well, that means that 19 out of 20 people are going to tell you that it was just fine, right? So in some ways, this is why anecdote is not very valuable overall, is because you'll get anecdotes that say something is really awesome and safe when it's not, right? Or you may get anecdotes and say, I did this and it was really horrible, but there's some other factors that's not really in that anecdote that could also account or explain for that difficulty or bad outcome. And this is exactly why, we like to focus on, it's like, why do these guys like always have to have a study? Like, why do they always need like some group to like look at? And this is exactly why, is because we understand that things happen on a probability or chance basis rather than this sort of black and white world. The world of drugs is all sorts of in between, right? So yeah, to your point, is there very well maybe people out there that did that exact thing and have that exact feeling that that was the most amazing euphoric thing ever, but it's still not good advice.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for touching on that one.
Yeah.
And I'm glad we talked a little bit about the stimulants there, like Ritalin and amoxicillin, which is a very interesting sort of ADHD medication and a non-stimulant medication apparently, but that's obviously, stimulants are a much larger discussion, and there's not just things like amoxicillin and Ritalin. There's also and cocaine, but there's also discussions there about like the cathinones and a number of other sort of like the morpholines or whatever, the phenetrazine and mefenmetrazine and 3-fluorofenmetrazine. Like there's a whole sort of thing that will just like.
There's hundreds of stimulants in the world. Right.
And then addiction risks and stuff. That's a deeper discussion that maybe can be saved for another time. Before we end, and I had never really heard much of these before, so I'd appreciate, maybe I've known a lot of things that you've said so far, but I'm really interested to hear about these next class of compounds, and hopefully I haven't forgotten any of the interactions in the last set, which is what's called serotonin modulators and stimulators and serotonin antagonists and reuptake inhibitors. I mean, the reuptake inhibitors obviously overlaps, but this sort of like, I don't know, this other class of antidepressants that act on serotonin but aren't necessarily reuptake inhibitors. Yeah,
miscellaneous, I guess. So the serotonin antagonist and reuptake inhibitors, or SARIs, include two drugs. The most popular one that is used by people is trazodone or Deseril. The other one is nefazodone or Cerazone. And trazodone is very sedating. It makes you very tired, makes you very sleepy. So instead of being used as an antidepressant, it's mostly actually just used as a sleep aid. And the kind of, as the name implies, serotonin antagonist, it at lower doses, trazodone seems to pretty potently be able to block serotonin receptors, and it blocks the serotonin 2A receptor, which is a critical receptor for psychedelic mechanism. So probably the prediction would be that trazodone diminishes or blocks the effects of psychedelic substances generally at lower doses. At higher doses, it still blocks serotonin receptors, but it also blocks serotonin reuptake. And now that blocking serotonin reuptake is one of those critical actions that confers real danger with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So probably low doses of trazodone, you're mostly thinking it's going to block the effects of serotonin antidepressants. But if you're really taking 150 milligrams or more of trazodone, then you're probably also at risk of like severe toxicities with monoamine oxidase inhibitor containing psychedelics. The other one, I'm not even sure which one, like serotonin modulators and stimulators. I think you're probably thinking of mirtazapine or Remeron is the drug out there. And this one has a pretty complex type of mechanism overall, but it does also block serotonin 2A receptors. It's also a pretty sedating type of antidepressant, to the point where sometimes it's a two birds, one stone type of idea. That's like, well, you're sort of depressed and you're sort of having a hard time sleeping, so a little bit of mirtazapine or Remeron. So I guess those like the other classes, right? The SARIs, like the trazodone, Deseril, mirtazapine, Remeron. I think like the summary version would be that they're sedating, but they also block serotonin 2A receptors, so they probably do have a blunting effect with serotonergic psychedelics. And depending on the dose of trazodone, you may also be at real risk with monoamine oxidase inhibitors for physical toxicities.
Mm-hmm. And the same still applies with ketamine. Probably not. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely not. Yeah, ketamine is very antidepressant friendly overall. Yeah.
Great. Well, Benjamin, you just gave us a huge download on this topic. And we didn't talk about analgesics. We didn't talk about really benzos or any kind of GABAergics. We didn't talk about antipsychotics. All of these things are things that you write about in depth on your website. And so in some sense, we've almost barely scratched the surface of what you're offering here, but this has been incredible. And I've really appreciated everything that you've offered here and the time that you've given to Adventures to the Mind and the listeners here today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And so we talked so much about antidepressants and sort of touched on the stimulants, but I'm a clinical psychiatric pharmacist. So also know about benzodiazepines, antipsychotics. We said the stimulants, different types of mood stabilizers. So I offer like individualized consultation services. So if people are taking psychotropics, curious about psychedelics, looking for more information on, maybe how to safely taper psychotropics, the timing of things, how their current regimen interacts with psychedelics. So that's like sort of an individualized service I have. I also have like just a drug information service. So you just got general questions that is sort of like, well, it's not necessarily me and my special situation, but maybe I'm involved in facilitating psychedelic experiences in legal jurisdictions, and I just kind of see this same question over and over again, and I really just want the answer. So that's something. That's all through spiritpharmacist.com. Also have another website, psychedelicschool.com, and this is an online education type of site where I offer different types of courses about psychedelics. I offer ones about pharmacology of psychedelics. My wife offers ones about psychedelic integration. But really the big idea behind Psychedelic School is like, how are we going to have this, robust psychedelic renaissance without some pretty robust psychedelic education efforts as well? The kind of words out there's this big buzz in the public, but the vast majority of people really aren't familiar with these substances and the kind of like paradigm of their use that we sort of started our conversation with. So these courses are really designed to ultimately empower the person to be in charge of their transformation. And some of this may involve self-healing, but I think it's more around the idea that, well, when you're empowered, when you know what your options are and you know the avenues to seek it from, and you know when you may need professional help and support or not, that's exactly where people need to be with their mental health. Like far too often, the story is, well, I was feeling kind of low and I went to my doctor and he said to start this. And so I started it and I didn't know anything about it and I still don't know anything about it, but it didn't really make me better and I'm not sure what to do now. Right? And it's kind of like, wow, like this is not the way it should be. Mm-hmm. Essentially, people need to know about the risks, benefits, and alternatives at the get-go and feel like they're making the choice that's the best for their health. So that's essentially where Psychedelic School is coming from, is trying to build these courses that not only teach you about psychedelics, but also empower you to know if psychedelics are you, and then essentially the paradigm that you need to heal yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, so this school, Psychedelic School, and Spirit Pharmacist are incredible resources. So thank you for bringing them together. And just for the listeners again, what are the URLs that they would search?
Yeah, so it's spiritpharmacist.com or psychedelicschool.com. So no special spellings or anything like that. Just Spirit Pharmacist, psychedelicschool.com. Yeah.
Great. And do you have some social media handles that you wanna put in here as well?
I do. I have a Facebook page with Spirit Pharmacist. I'll say that we're working on the social media strategy because I am not the type of person that has the patience to make posts all the time and that kind of thing. Every time I make a blog, I post it. I post like the educational videos I have, but probably my websites are more robust as far as having the totality of information and things that I've done. Yeah,
it's likely better for everybody's brain power, attentional capacity, self-worth, ability to navigate conflict, to just stay off social media in general as best they can, or to temper it significantly. So yeah, maybe just straight to the URL is the best choice.
Maybe, but yeah, I mean, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. I do have a Twitter account. I don't tweet, but it's all Spirit Pharmacist, the handle for all of them. So yeah, Psychedelic School on Facebook too. I don't know. We have the social media handles, I guess, is what I'm saying. And if you like social media, you're on social media, then you are more than welcome to follow us and interact with us there. Yeah.
Great. Well, Benjamin Malcolm, Spirit Pharmacist, thank you so much for coming on Adventures Through the Mind.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And cut.
Okay, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. As I mentioned in the intro, there's an important update about the courses that Benjamin is offering. Psychedelic School is no longer a thing, but instead all of his courses are being offered through spiritpharmacist.com. And he's recently implemented a monthly membership program that offers discounted rates on private consultations, ability to ask questions and get them answered via email anytime, access to all the courses he's made, a library of drug interaction guides, a live monthly member summit, and discounted membership to full-time students, like academic students in school. So again, that's all at spiritpharmacist.com. So if you're interested, go check that out. And if you like the episode, please give it a share on social media. And if you like the episode enough to throw some money at it, throw some money in my direction as a expression of monitude, you can do so through PayPal or cryptocurrency. Links in the description to this episode wherever you're checking it out. And if you're really appreciating the show in general, I would love for you to become my patron on Patreon and offer me a monthly pledge of even as little as a cup of coffee. So patreon.com/James W. Gesso is where you could do that. But we're all familiar with Patreon at this point. So thank you very much for contributing financially to the show in whatever way is available and feels relevant to you. And thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. And until then, take care.